Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that doesn't usually make it into war documentaries or high school history books. Food. Specifically, trench food. The glorious, gritty, occasionally horrifying fuel that kept millions of soldiers alive, barely, during World War I. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When it came to trench cuisine, the British Army didn't aim for pleasure, just basic survival and a mild sense of disappointment. Their standard rations read like the beginning of a Victorian horror story: bully beef, hardtack biscuits, and endless cups of slightly muddy tea. Let's start with bully beef. It was canned corned beef, preserved in gelatinous fat, and packed into tins that required a bayonet, a rock, or divine intervention to open. It had the consistency of regret, and the flavour of something that used to be meat, maybe, in a past life. Soldiers ate it cold, spread it on crackers, or fried it, assuming they could find a fire that wasn't being shelled. Then there was the hardtack, affectionately called toothbreakers, or dog biscuits. These were dense, dry crackers that could withstand water, time, and small arms fire. Many soldiers soaked them in tea or soup just to make them chewable. Some swore they were made during the Boer War and simply reissued. That's not a joke. That's logistics. Now, to wash it all down, tea. Sweet, black, and strong enough to stand a spoon upright. It was the one comforting item in the British ration. It was served at all hours and in all situations, before a charge, during a gas attack, after burying a friend. One officer claimed that tea had saved more British lives than any bulletproof vest, but ration quality varied wildly. Frontline soldiers often went days without fresh supplies. When food arrived, it might be waterlogged, mouldy, or looted by rats with better instincts. Some men boiled stews from scrap, bully beef, biscuit crumbs, and a pinch of desperation, and gave it ironic names like trench pudding. The British also handed out a peculiar item called Maconochie stew, a canned concoction of turnips, potatoes, and fat, with the faint aroma of death. Eaten cold, it tasted like grief. Heated up, slightly less so. If the British trench diet was a test of endurance, the French approach was a daily act of culinary defiance. Even in the mud, surrounded by artillery, barbed wire, and death, French soldiers, or poilus, tried to keep mealtime anchored to some vestige of civilization. The foundation of the French ration was bread. Lots of it. Soldiers received loaves of crusty pain de campagne, often baked in massive batches and transported in sacks slung over mules. Was it always fresh? Not a chance. But it was French bread. And even stale, it beat British hardtack on taste and on dental risk. Alongside the bread came cheese, sometimes tinned meat, and when luck was on their side, sardines or beans. But no matter the rest of the meal, one thing rarely failed to arrive: wine. Yes, despite the horrors of trench warfare, French soldiers received regular wine rations, about half a litre per day. This wasn't Chateau Margaux. It was usually weak, sour, and best consumed quickly before the cork remembered it wasn't a seal. But it lifted morale and reminded men they were still human, or at least French. Even in mud and madness, some soldiers tried to cook properly. Makeshift stoves were built from metal tins or salvaged debris. Men would heat water in helmets, stew leftover meat, and stir soups with bayonets. One sergeant famously made omelettes in shell casings. No one asked how he got the eggs. No one wanted to know. The pinard, or wine, became so culturally essential that military leaders worried more about wine shortages than ammunition. Soldiers joked that they could endure machine guns, but not dry canteens. Still, supplies weren't always consistent. During long bombardments, food could rot in transit or arrive filled with shell holes. Rations often had to be shared, bartered, or stolen. But the spirit of the French soldier was clear: If you're going to suffer, at least do it with a crust of bread, a sip of wine, and something vaguely resembling cheese. Early in the war, German soldiers ate surprisingly well. Rations were hearty, organised, and designed with German efficiency. Dark rye bread, sausages, smoked meats, potatoes, sauerkraut, and strong black coffee. For a brief moment, it almost resembled a rustic picnic, if you ignored the rats, the mud, and the screaming shells overhead. But as the war dragged on and the Allied blockade tightened, the German diet underwent a rapid and depressing transformation. Welcome to the age of ersatz, a word that roughly translates to replacement, but more accurately means not quite food. Ersatz coffee was made from roasted barley, chicory, or acorns. It smelled vaguely like coffee, but drinking it felt like punishment. Ersatz flour included things like sawdust, potato starch, and whatever the quartermaster swore was nutritional. Ersatz meat came in cans, never identified the animal, and may not have contained one. But through it all, black bread remained the German soldier's staple. Dense, sour, and able to withstand trench humidity, it was practically a defensive weapon. You could eat it, use it as a sandbag, or knock out a rat with it in one solid swing. Some even claimed it had shrapnel-resistant properties. They weren't wrong. As conditions worsened, meat became a memory. Cabbage, turnips, and thin soups filled with mystery ingredients took centre stage. Fat was prized. If someone managed to secure bacon grease or lard, it became social currency. Soldiers would trade cigarettes, extra boots, even ammunition, all for a smear of something that could make boiled turnip soup less soul-destroying. And yet, despite the decline, German soldiers remained resourceful. Field kitchens kept operating. Some dug improvised ovens, others bartered with local civilians or foraged what they could between bombardments. Desperation breeds creativity, and a lot of the stews that emerged from the trenches were both horrifying and oddly effective. Still, nothing symbolised the change quite like the transition from sausage to ersatz sausage, a culinary fall from grace that haunted stomachs across the Western Front. By 1918, many German troops were running on empty, physically and calorically. Hunger wasn't just discomfort, it was strategic collapse. The soldiers felt it. And so did the war effort. Feeding an army is hard. Feeding a multi-ethnic empire with a dozen languages, no unified menu, and a crumbling supply chain. That was the Austro-Hungarian military's special brand of masochism. The empire stretched from Vienna to Sarajevo, with soldiers from Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, Croatia, Poland, and beyond, each with their own dietary preferences and national dishes. The result in the trenches? A culinary identity crisis served lukewarm. Standard rations included black bread, sometimes mouldy and always dense, and soup, the universal answer to what's left in the wagon. The soup might contain beans, barley, old potatoes, dried peas, turnips, or a bone with emotional value. Sometimes all at once. It was referred to lovingly, or bitterly, as Eintopf, meaning one pot, which also described the army's entire food strategy. The Hungarian troops often longed for paprika-heavy stews. The Czechs missed dumplings. The Slovenians craved something that wasn't grey. But the cooks? They did what they could with what was available, and what was available was almost never enough. One saving grace was lard, which featured heavily. It was smeared on bread, used in soups, and occasionally eaten with a spoon if things got really bad. Nutritional? Arguably. Delicious? No. But in trench warfare, calories beat cuisine every time. Logistics were a nightmare. Supplies got delayed, lost, or rerouted. Some troops went days without full meals, leading to foraging, looting, or repurposing horses into stew, often without asking the horse's opinion. Some regional units did manage to prepare local dishes when conditions allowed, using ingredients from the countryside, or bartered with civilians. But most soldiers just tried to survive the culinary roulette of the central kitchen. And let's not forget coffee. or at least a dark liquid labelled coffee. In reality, it was often roasted grain or beet pulp masquerading as caffeine. Soldiers drank it anyway. It was hot, bitter, and slightly less depressing than cold water. Ultimately, Austro-Hungarian trench food wasn't unified, but it was shared. And in that misery, there was a strange kind of camaraderie. After all, if you can survive boiled turnip stew and shellfire in the same afternoon, you're bonded for life. If trench food across Europe was bleak, Russian rations somehow made everyone else look overfed. The Russian soldiers' menu during World War I was an exercise in austere suffering, fortified by orthodox faith and extremely low expectations. The staple? Black bread, dense, sour and usually frozen solid in winter. It was hacked apart with bayonets or smashed on rocks. If you could chew it without fracturing a molar, congratulations. You were halfway to sustenance. Next came sallow, cured slabs of pig fat, served cold. No spices, no ceremony, just pure fat. Russians didn't nibble it. They bit it like candy bars. Nutritional? Yes. Appetizing? Only if you've been shell-shocked into not caring. Kasha, or buckwheat porridge, was a common sight when available. Hearty, filling, and mercifully warm, it was one of the few meals that resembled something you might eat voluntarily. Still, it often came unseasoned, and in quantities best described as symbolic. Cabbage soup, also known as shchi, was the closest thing to a hot meal most troops would get. Thin, watery and cabbage-heavy, it was rumoured to lower morale by 12% per spoonful. Occasionally a stray bone or mysterious lump would float to the surface, greeted with cheers and deep suspicion. What about meat? Rare and philosophical. When meat appeared, it was either ancient, grey, or possibly horse. No one asked. The line between hunger and dignity was thin, and most soldiers crossed it daily. The Russian supply lines, already stretched across a massive empire, were spectacularly disorganized. Soldiers often received their food late, if at all. During long offensives, they resorted to looting local villages, boiling bark, or just chewing on their own sadness. And then there was vodka, the unofficial ration of the Russian army. It wasn't always available, but when it was, it functioned as painkiller, morale booster, and, if drunk fast enough, soup substitute. Unfortunately, it was often watered down or replaced with things that merely resembled vodka and smelled like furniture polish. In the end, Russian trench food was less about what you ate and more about what you survived. If it had calories and didn't fight back, you were grateful. And if it came warm, that was a miracle. Or a trap. When the Americans finally showed up in 1917, they arrived with fresh optimism, shiny gear, and a firm belief that their food was better than everyone else's. And technically, it was, if you judged meals by calorie count and not emotional trauma. At the core of every American soldier's diet was the reserve ration. A lovingly packed death row of canned meat, hardtack biscuits, coffee, sugar, salt, and the most American of condiments, 3 cigarettes per meal. Yes, the US Army genuinely issued smokes as part of dinner. Lung health could wait. Flavour was clearly beyond hope. Let's start with the meat. Corned beef hash, packed into cans with a consistency that can best be described as fork-resistant. Cold, it resembled carpet padding. Hot, it resembled steaming carpet padding. Soldiers nicknamed it goldfish, not because it swam, but because it came in tins and made you nostalgic for home-cooked meals that didn't taste like sadness. Then came the bacon, theoretically a morale booster until you opened the box. It arrived greyish, fatty, and so salty you could use it to preserve a horse. Eaten raw, it was chewy. Fried, it became vaguely edible, especially if you hadn't eaten since Belgium. Beans, though, were the real American trench classic. Canned, baked, floating, dry. You name it, they shipped it. The troops quickly learned that nothing brings men together like communal bean digestion in a shared dugout. But what the Yanks really worshipped was coffee. Brewed strong enough to strip paint and poured from kettles that hadn't been cleaned since Fort Leavenworth, it was the trench equivalent of holy water, served black, bitter, and hotter than your rifle barrel, and that was on a good day. And let's not forget chewing gum, thoughtfully issued to combat stress, rot teeth more slowly, and maybe keep you from chewing your own fingers during shellfire. In fairness, American rations were reliable, which made them exotic by European standards. Sure, they lacked flavour, but they showed up on time, didn't bite back, and rarely included live worms. That said, after 5 days of beans and hash, even the Germans started to feel less threatening than another breakfast of meat ? Feeding an army across a vast empire is never easy. Feeding an army across deserts, mountains, and collapsing infrastructure, with one foot in the 20th century and the other in complete logistical chaos? That was the Ottoman Empire's trench kitchen. The average Ottoman soldier, often Turkish, Arab, Kurdish, or from other far-flung regions, received rations that were sparse, repetitive, and perfectly calibrated to induce culinary despair. The staple was lentils. Boiled into mush, fried into patties, or simply stared at in silence, lentils were the backbone of the trench diet. Not by choice, by inevitability. Onions were the next big hit. Raw, pickled, or roasted if you could find fire. Nutritionally honest, but emotionally devastating. And then there was flatbread, which was actually decent when fresh. But this was the trenches, so it rarely was. Once hardened, it doubled as armour plating or emergency sandals. Meat? Let's not be greedy. When it arrived, it was usually salted lamb or goat, chewy, gamey, and old enough to remember the Crimean War. Most soldiers saw meat only on special occasions or in dreams. In the meantime, they made do with bulgur, rice, or whatever didn't fight back in the supply sack. The Ottoman supply chain, never known for speed, frequently broke down. Food was carried in carts, on mules, or on the backs of soldiers themselves. If it rained, supplies got soaked. If it was sunny, they spoiled. If it was neutral weather, they got stolen. There was no winning. To their credit, many Ottoman soldiers were decent field cooks. Using nothing but a dented pot, a pinch of cumin, and sheer willpower, they could turn rations into something resembling food. But let's be clear. This was creative survival, not fine dining. The real tragedy? No coffee. At least not the good kind. Once a staple of the empire, proper Turkish coffee became a casualty of war. What replaced it was bitter, thin, and brewed from roasted chickpeas or acorns. It did not inspire poetry. Canadian soldiers entered the war under British command, and therefore inherited the British ration system. This meant they too were blessed with the holy trinity of trench cuisine: bully beef, hardtack, and tea. But while the food was the same, the attitude was very, very Canadian. Let's begin with the dreaded bully beef, still the same tin of glistening compressed regret as issued to the British, except colder and possibly frozen solid. In winter, Canadian troops reportedly used unopened cans as ice bricks. In summer, they just left them unopened for safety reasons. Hardtack was another joy. The biscuit equivalent of a concrete slab, it was dry, flavourless, and occasionally dated to the previous war. Soldiers dunked it in tea, soup, or anything wet enough to prevent emergency dental surgery. One Canadian private claimed he used his as a doorstop after the war. It worked perfectly. And then, of course, there was tea. Strong, hot, and brewed at every opportunity. Even under shellfire, Canadian troops could be seen crouched behind sandbags, clutching steaming enamel mugs like they were warding off demons. Tea wasn't a drink. It was a national identity with caffeine. Unlike their British counterparts, some Canadians brought homegrown morale boosters. A bit of maple syrup smuggled from home. Maybe some molasses cookies in a tin from a prairie aunt. These treasures were rare and naturally shared with everyone, because it's hard to eat while someone's watching you with frostbitten eyes. And let's not forget the bacon, issued in generous blocks of salty, fatty meat. It was fried over improvised fires whenever someone dared risk attracting artillery. Canadians learned quickly that bacon is wonderful, right up until a rat tries to steal it mid-sizzle. The Canadian supply system, while still reliant on the Empire's larger logistics network, tended to function a bit more efficiently, or at least creatively. Rations were stretched, swapped, and occasionally liberated from nearby units with fewer lookouts. When the British Empire called, India answered, sending over 1 million troops to fight in a war that had nothing to do with them, and even less to offer them in terms of familiar food. Indian soldiers, many of whom followed strict religious or cultural dietary rules, quickly learned that trench rations were less about sustenance and more about identity loss by the spoonful. The standard British ration, bully beef, hardtack, and tea, was, to many Indian soldiers, completely inedible. Hindus were offered beef, Muslims were handed pork, and everyone, regardless of background, was forced to eat something that tasted like colonial indifference. To their credit, many Indian units refused to eat forbidden meats, even under fire. Instead, they pooled resources, cooked separately when allowed, and used anything from dented pots to steel helmets to boil dal, rice, or sabzi. On good days, they managed to replicate simple dishes. On bad days, they boiled onions and hoped for divine intervention. Spices, crucial in Indian cooking, were rare, unless smuggled in care packages or liberated from British officers' stores. Without them, every dish tasted like Europe, grey, wet, and vaguely resentful. British commanders, always keen to misunderstand everything, occasionally tried to improve matters by issuing curried bully beef, which was just regular bully beef sprinkled with imperialism and mild regret. Despite the indignities, Indian soldiers improvised. Chapatis were made with trench flour fried on shovels, lentils were soaked in mess tins. Some men carried spice mixtures in small cloth bags, guarding them more closely than their rifles. And whenever there was time, meals were shared communally. The food may have been thin, but the dignity was thick. But this wasn't just about flavour, it was about faith. Getting the wrong food wasn't just inconvenient, it was spiritually disastrous. Some refused rations for days. Others bartered with local civilians or other colonial troops to survive without compromise. Indian troops faced not only hunger and cold, but the sense of being utterly misunderstood by the empire they served. And yet they endured, one cumin-scented steam cloud at a time. Serving under French and British command, African colonial troops were often deployed far from home, and even further from food that made sense to them. Originating from Senegal, Algeria, Morocco, and other parts of the empire, these men brought their own culinary traditions, and ran face first into Europe's tinned tragedy. The French, to their credit, issued slightly more edible rations than the British. But for West African troops, a tin of cold beef and a hunk of bread didn't quite scratch the itch for millet porridge or spicy groundnut stew. It mostly scratched confusion. Standard issue included hardtack, tinned meat, and the occasional chunk of salted fish. But these foods clashed violently with local diets, digestively and spiritually. Many troops improvised their own kitchens right behind the trenches, fueled by wood fires, helmet lids, and stubborn memory. Rice, when available, was turned into something nourishing. A pot of boiling water, a handful of grains, and a few scavenged spices could create a taste of home. Dried okra, onions, and peppers, smuggled, bartered, or foraged, transformed drab French rations into something vaguely recognisable. Some Algerian and Moroccan units carried small tagines or metal pots, using them to create slow-cooked stews that made neighbouring soldiers jealous and confused in equal measure. Even under shell fire, they stirred, seasoned, and served, because if the end was coming, it should at least smell like cumin. But the cultural misunderstandings ran deep. Pork was frequently issued to Muslim troops. Religious fasting was ignored. French officers, baffled that their rations weren't universally adored, responded the only way a colonial officer could, by blaming the troops for being ungrateful. Still, the food was only part of the struggle. Many African troops were treated as expendable labour. They dug trenches, carried supplies, and manned the most dangerous front lines. Meals were rushed, rationed unfairly, or skipped entirely when things got complicated. And yet they cooked, they shared, they adapted, they resisted the great European flattening of taste with fire, spice, and creativity. The Italian soldier marched to war with visions of pasta, polenta, and mama's ragu. What he got was a bowl of beans, a chunk of military bread, and the frostbitten realization that no one cooks al dente under artillery fire. Fighting along the mountainous Isonzo front, Italian troops endured one of the most punishing terrains of the war. Their food had to be hauled by mule over jagged cliffs and through freezing valleys. Assuming the mules weren't shelled, stolen, or simply too depressed to continue. The standard ration? Pane di guerra, war bread, a dense, greyish loaf made from wheat, barley, and existential despair. It was sturdy enough to stop shrapnel and dry enough to suck the moisture out of your memories. Alongside this came beans, usually white or brown, boiled into submission and often flavoured with disappointment and melted snow. Salt pork occasionally made an appearance, adding fat and salt, but not much dignity. The meat was tough and stringy, often hacked straight from frozen slabs with trench knives or creative profanity. If the supply lines held, a big if, soldiers might get macaroni or polenta, though both arrived cold, congealed, and far from poetic. Cooking in the trenches was borderline impossible, especially when your stove was a rusty shell casing and your fuel was half a fence post. And then there was vino, the modest Italian wine ration that tried its best to lift spirits, though it mostly lifted eyebrows. Thin and sour, it was less Chianti elegance and more accident in a vineyard. Still, a warm sip of red wine in a snow-covered trench was enough to remind you life had once involved tables and chairs. Logistics were a constant enemy. In winter, food froze before it reached the front. In summer, it spoiled during transit. And in between, it was stolen by rats, officers, or your own stomach before you even opened the can. Despite it all, Italian soldiers kept eating, singing, and sometimes even seasoning. If they couldn't get home to Mama's kitchen, they'd settle for making trench risotto with extra mud. If the Western Front was mud and mustard gas, the Balkan Front was mud, mountains, and a whole lot of cabbage. Fighting here was brutal, chaotic, and usually cold. And the food matched the mood with admirable consistency. Balkan troops, whether Serbian, Bulgarian, Montenegrin, or others, mostly subsisted on whatever could be boiled into a stew without violating the laws of physics. Cabbage, potatoes, and onions were common, affordable, and sturdy enough to survive long transport. Unfortunately, so was the smell, which clung to uniforms, tents, and probably the enemy's nostrils downwind. The base of nearly every meal was soup, thin, greasy, and cooked over campfires if you were lucky, or over burning furniture if you weren't. A good soup might contain beans, barley, or a mystery legume donated by fate. A great soup might contain actual meat, usually mutton, pork fat, or in extreme cases, a former cavalry horse who had served honourably, and then, well, deliciously. Bread was present when available, but often scarce. Soldiers sometimes fashioned biscuits from flour and water, dried hard as stone, and used interchangeably as food and blunt instruments. Coffee was rare, and usually replaced with roasted barley or acorns, a pattern seen across the war's poorer fronts. The resulting beverage looked like mud, smelled like firewood, and functioned mainly as a warm liquid placebo. Balkan soldiers, many of whom were peasants before the war, were used to making do with little. Improvisation was key. A scrap of smoked meat, a sprig of wild herbs, or the occasional garlic clove could elevate a bucket of boiled despair into something almost nourishing. Almost. Unfortunately, supply lines in the Balkans were imaginative. Roads were primitive, railroads non-existent in many areas, and food often travelled by ox cart or sheer hope. Rations arrived late, incomplete, or never. Foraging became a necessary skill. Stealing from abandoned villages was common. Trading cigarettes for eggs? Practically an Olympic sport. Yet morale somehow persisted. Because nothing brings men together like suffering over the same pot of overcooked cabbage. If trench rations were bad, prisoner of war meals made them look gourmet. Captured soldiers in World War I found themselves stuck in camps where the only thing worse than the company was the cooking, if one can call boiling despair into a pot cooking. The standard POW meal across most camps, German, Russian, French, British, was soup. Always soup. Thin, grey, occasionally warm, and often described by survivors as watery cabbage or hot liquid with floaters. No one knew what floated. No one wanted to ask. Alongside this culinary swamp came a chunk of bread, usually stale and dense enough to serve as a doorstop or bludgeon. This bread was often stretched with sawdust or potato starch, depending on who was pretending it was still edible. Meat was mythical. When it did appear, it was measured in milligrams, a sliver of old sausage, a bone with a memory of flavour. Once, famously, a French POW camp served something they called beef, and it turned out to be boiled rat. Reviews were mixed. The rat did not comment. Calories were low, starvation level low. Many prisoners lost significant weight in the first few weeks. Some adapted, others didn't. In Russian camps, where supply lines were basically just wishful thinking, starvation was common. In German camps, rations declined sharply as the war dragged on and resources ran out. Enter the Red Cross parcel, a literal lifeline. These care packages, mostly from the British, included tinned meat, biscuits, chocolate, tea, and soap. When they arrived, they were treasured. When they didn't, things got medieval. Prisoners would trade, gamble, and guard their parcels like dragons hoarding canned milk. Some prisoners even became camp chefs, creating elaborate meals from the meagre contents of Red Cross boxes. Sardine pâté, biscuit pudding, even mock roasts. All prepared on makeshift stoves in dirt-floored huts under watchful guards with no appreciation for culinary genius. Food became currency. A tin of jam could get you socks. A bar of chocolate? Protection. A slice of real bread? Practically political leverage. Behind every exhausted soldier gnawing on mystery meat stood a forgotten figure with a ladle and a 1,000-yard stare. The trench cook. These were not celebrity chefs. They didn't have recipe books or aprons. They had dented pots, unstable fires, and the daily challenge of turning military rations into something that wouldn't be used as trench mortar. Field kitchens were mobile, wheeled contraptions dragged behind the lines and disguised as soup-making devices. In reality, they were smoke-belching tanks full of stew, tea, and ambition. Cooks had to work with what they had, which was almost always a shortage. A trench cook's day began early and ended whenever the artillery said it could. Meals had to be prepared in large batches, using ingredients with more preservatives than nutritional value. Turnips, cabbage, onions, and salted meat were the foundations. Flavour was optional and usually replaced with sarcasm. Despite the odds, these cooks created something vaguely edible out of almost nothing. They made stews with more water than ingredients. They rehydrated hardtack biscuits until they resembled bread again. They stretched a handful of beans across a pot, meant for 30 men. If culinary miracles existed, they were buried in the back of a trench behind a cook swearing at his ladle. And still, the food had to be delivered. Under fire. Across mud, barbed wire, and occasionally through areas where rats had claimed squatters' rights. Soldiers would risk life and limb for a hot meal, and cooks risked theirs trying to get it to them while pushing soup carts through hell. Some armies even developed makeshift fire trenches where food could be heated without the telltale smoke plumes attracting enemy snipers. In cold weather, these spots became sacred. In summer, they became fly farms. Field cooks were also therapists. Soldiers complained to them, joked with them, begged them for extra bread. A good cook could keep a unit functioning. A bad cook, well, they didn't last long. Rumour has it one British unit almost mutinied over burnt porridge. After thousands of miles of mud, millions of bullets, and more cabbage than any war ever asked for, one thing remained constant across every front, every army, and every miserable trench. Eating kept you human. Barely. Trench food wasn't about pleasure. It wasn't even always about nutrition. It was about calories. Dense, greasy, bland calories. Enough to keep a man marching, shooting, digging, and occasionally sobbing into a bowl of rehydrated despair. Soldiers learned to live without seasoning, without proper utensils, and sometimes without chewing. They ate while crouched, standing, running, or lying in 6 inches of freezing water. If it was hot, it was good. If it was solid, even better. If it didn't move on its own, you were having a good day. And yet, food became something more. In the worst conditions, it was ritual. Brewing tea, sharing biscuits, fighting over the slightly less soggy piece of bread. It was comfort, not because it tasted good, but because it meant you were still alive to taste it. A hot meal could lift spirits faster than a speech. A tin of jam could start a friendship. A missing ration could start a fistfight. Food was currency, therapy, diplomacy, and sometimes the only thing standing between sanity and the abyss. Each army had its quirks: British tea, French wine, German black bread, Russian kasha, American beans, Ottoman lentils, but the shared experience was universal. Misery with a spoon. And let's not forget the improvisation. From helmet-lid stews to coffee brewed with mud and courage, soldiers across continents invented new ways to make their meals suck just a little less. Field kitchens stretched resources with the creativity of exhausted geniuses. Soldiers learned to cook with whatever didn't explode. Even in captivity, even in starvation, food meant something. It meant culture, home, identity. The small flame of who you were before the war shoved you into a hole and handed you a spoon. Because in a world where everything was falling apart, a hot meal, even one made of fat, fear and cabbage, was a reminder. You hadn't given up yet. Long before scalpels, anesthesia, or even the concept of germ theory, there was trepanation, the bold, borderline insane art of scraping, drilling, or cutting a hole into someone's skull. It sounds like something you'd find in a medieval torture chamber, but it actually predates civilization itself. Archaeologists have found trepanned skulls dating back over 7,000 years, scattered across the globe, from the highlands of Peru to the plains of Ukraine. Apparently, cracking someone's head open was humanity's first attempt at neurosurgery. But here's the real kicker. Some of these people survived. Not just one or two. In some ancient graves, healed bone around the hole shows that patients lived long enough for their skulls to start growing back, meaning these weren't botched killings, but actual medical procedures. Which leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. Someone, somewhere, looked at a seizure, a headache, or a mental breakdown and thought, what if we just opened the skull and let the evil spirits out? And that's exactly what they believed. Early medicine wasn't about bacteria or tumours. It was about spirits, curses, and imbalance. Trepanation wasn't seen as risky. It was therapeutic. Headache, drill, mood swings, drill, war injury, drill, failed marriage. Okay, probably not that, but you get the idea. The tools used were, let's say, rustic. Flint scrapers, obsidian knives, and later bronze instruments were used to make perfectly circular openings. It's believed that sometimes the patient was awake, held down by helpful friends or family. No anesthetic, of course, just sheer willpower, adrenaline, and maybe some fermented berry juice if you were lucky. What's astonishing is the precision. Some skulls show clean, symmetrical holes, better than what some first-year med students could manage. These early surgeons, while lacking modern knowledge, had developed consistent techniques that were passed down through generations. And while their understanding of the brain was about as sophisticated as astrology, their practical skill with a chisel and some nerve was undeniable. If there was one ancient civilization that treated surgery with a surprising mix of science and superstition, it was the Egyptians. These linen-wrapped morticians didn't just excel at preserving the dead, they were also quite good at patching up the living. Thanks to the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 3,600-year-old surgical manual that reads like a battlefield medic's diary, we know the Egyptians had procedures for fractures, dislocations, abscesses, and even spinal injuries. It's practically the ancient version of WebMD, minus the part where every symptom leads to death. Egyptian surgeons operated under the watchful gaze of their gods, especially Imhotep, the architect-turned-physician-turned-deity. If your skull was cracked or your shoulder dislocated, your doctor might first mutter a few prayers, consult the stars, and then reach for his obsidian scalpel. Surgery wasn't just a physical practice, it was spiritual warfare against disease and evil spirits. Their tools were surprisingly sophisticated. Bronze scalpels, forceps, hooks, cauterizing irons, and bone saws. Sure, they weren't sterilized, unless waving incense over them counts, but they were used with careful methodology. The Egyptians knew how to stitch wounds, drain abscesses, and even treat fractures with splints made from reeds and linen soaked in resin. And when it came to infection, enter the MVP of the ancient Egyptian medicine cabinet, honey. Antibacterial, sticky, and surprisingly effective, honey was slathered onto wounds to keep them clean and promote healing. It worked so well, in fact, that modern science has confirmed its usefulness. Imagine surviving a crocodile bite only to be treated with the same thing you put in your tea. But the Egyptians also had their limits. They were wary of anything involving the belly or the brain. Internal organs were considered divine and off-limits. So if you had a stomach ulcer or brain tumour, your odds weren't great. Unless, of course, your condition happened to be something that could be soothed with a poultice, a chant, or a strategically placed amulet. Still, Egypt gave us one of the first medical systems that tried to separate treatment from sheer guesswork. Even if the diagnosis sometimes included a curse or two, their approach to surgery was detailed, organised, and shockingly advanced for a society that mummified cats. And if you're wondering, yes, the same people who built the pyramids could also remove a splinter with divine precision. Long before modern hospitals and sterile gloves, ancient India had a man named Sushruta, a physician so skilled and methodical that he's often referred to as the father of surgery. And no, this isn't one of those titles we just toss around. This guy literally wrote the book on surgery. It was called the Sushruta Samhita, a Sanskrit medical text compiled around 600 BCE, and it described over 300 surgical procedures, 120 instruments, and techniques that would make your average medieval barber surgeon faint. Sushruta was no back-alley butcher. He performed complex operations with remarkable finesse: cataract removals, hernia repairs, bone realignment, amputations, and even cosmetic surgery. That's right, India gave us the first known rhinoplasty. If your nose got chopped off, which thanks to the criminal justice system of the time wasn't exactly rare, Sushruta could fashion you a new one using skin from your cheek or forehead. No anesthesia, of course. Just a stiff upper lip and some herbal wine to take the edge off. Surgery in ancient India was deeply intertwined with Ayurveda, a holistic system of healing that balanced body, mind, and spirit. While surgery was considered a last resort, preferably after herbs, massages, prayers, and the occasional cow urine therapy, it was still practiced with impressive technical understanding. Wounds were cleaned with alcohol, sutured using plant fibers, and dressed with antiseptic herbs. And unlike in Europe centuries later, Indian surgeons knew that cleanliness mattered. Training was hands-on and brutal. Students practiced incisions on vegetables, leather, dead animals, and even water-filled bladders to simulate the feel of human tissue. Before they touched a real patient, they had to prove their steadiness. Because once you start cutting into someone with a bronze scalpel, you don't get a second chance. Ayurvedic texts also emphasized ethical practice, including informed consent and treating the poor for free. It wasn't just about curing illness. it was about moral duty. In a world where medicine often leaned toward the mystical ancient Indian surgery stood out for its structured, empirical approach. If you thought the Greeks spent all their time inventing democracy and arguing about the nature of reality, think again. They also dabbled in surgery, awkward, painful, often terrifying surgery. Ancient Greek medicine was a chaotic mix of philosophy, superstition, and guts, literal guts, frequently exposed on the battlefield or in a cramped healer's room. At the centre of it all was Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine. He famously separated disease from divine punishment and tried to base treatment on observation and logic. Revolutionary stuff. Until you realise most surgery still involved cutting into someone while they screamed. Hippocrates himself wasn't big on complex procedures, but he knew a thing or two about dislocations, fractures, abscess drainage, and the always fun process of bloodletting. Nothing says healing like opening a vein and hoping for the best. But things really escalated when Galen came onto the scene in the 2nd century CE. A Greek physician working in Rome, Galen had an obsession with anatomy, except he wasn't allowed to dissect humans. So, like any enterprising scientist of the day, he turned to monkeys, pigs, and the occasional gladiator for practice. He performed vivisections on animals and built detailed anatomical theories, some of which were wildly incorrect, but impressive for someone guessing without Google or cadavers. Greek surgical tools were surprisingly advanced: scalpels, forceps, catheters, bone saws, and hooks. The Greeks even used cauterization, burning a wound shut with hot metal, to stop bleeding. And while that sounds medieval, it actually worked. Painful, but effective. Think of it as ancient laser surgery, except the laser is a glowing hot iron bar and you're wide awake. Battlefields were the real training grounds. Greek physicians learned to deal with arrow wounds, crushed limbs, and head injuries in real time, with zero margin for error and zero morphine. If you survived a spear to the gut and your surgeon didn't pass out from the sight of intestines, you might just live. But Greek surgery, for all its tools and theories, was still anchored in the four humours, a charmingly unscientific idea that your health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So if your operation didn't kill you, an overenthusiastic leech treatment just might. The Romans weren't exactly known for subtlety, and their approach to surgery was no exception. While the Greeks gave us theory and ethics, the Romans gave us field hospitals and emergency trauma care. When your empire stretches across continents and your favourite pastime involves stabbing people in arenas, you get very good, very fast, at putting bodies back together. At the centre of this blood-soaked innovation was the medicus, Rome's answer to the battlefield surgeon. Stationed with legions, these hardy physicians operated out of mobile hospitals called valetudinaria, set up near military camps. These weren't places of comfort. They were tents of torment, filled with wounded soldiers, clanging tools, and the smell of iron and sweat. Roman surgeons excelled at trauma care, arrow extractions, broken bone repair, cauterization, wound stitching, and amputations. If your arm was dangling by a thread, the medicus had a solution, usually involving a saw, some boiling water, and the hope that your heart could take it. Anesthesia? Absolutely not. If you were lucky, you got wine or opium. If you were unlucky, you got held down. But they weren't improvising in the dark. Roman medical texts, like those of Celsus, detailed precise procedures, from eye surgeries to hemorrhoid removals. Celsus, ever the charmer, described how to lance an abscess with disturbingly gleeful clarity. Make an incision long enough for a finger to enter. How poetic. Their instruments, meanwhile, wouldn't look out of place in a modern ER. The Romans had forceps, scalpels, hooks, retractors, bone drills, and catheters. Many were made of bronze or iron and crafted with care. Some even had adjustable screws, because if there's one thing the Romans loved more than conquering Gaul, it was proper engineering. Despite all this gore, Roman medicine was surprisingly systematic. Wounds were cleaned, often with vinegar, bandaged and monitored. They understood the danger of infection even if they didn't know why it happened. And they practiced something astonishingly close to triage, sorting the dying from the savable. Still, their understanding had limits. Internal surgeries were rarely attempted. If your guts were poking out, the prognosis was usually good luck. But for external wounds, especially in war, Roman surgeons saved lives at a scale unseen in the ancient world. Ancient Chinese medicine was a masterclass in balance, between yin and yang, body and spirit, and most importantly, between cutting someone open and maybe just giving them acupuncture instead. While Chinese civilization developed one of the most advanced medical systems in the ancient world, surgery was approached with intense caution. The body was considered sacred, a gift from one's ancestors. So poking around inside it, that was not taken lightly. But when surgery was unavoidable, like in cases of trauma, tumours or severe abscesses, Chinese surgeons rose to the occasion with surprising ingenuity. Records from as early as the Zhou dynasty, c. 1000 BCE, mention surgical procedures, including wound treatment and even organ removal. And by the Han dynasty, practitioners like Hua Tuo had become legendary. Hua Tuo wasn't just some herbalist with a lucky streak. He was a pioneer. He performed abdominal surgeries and tumour excisions, and even used anaesthesia. Let that sink in. While much of the ancient world was just offering patients a stick to bite down on, Hua Tuo created an anaesthetic mixture called Ma Fei San, made from wine and powdered herbs like datura. Basically, it was ancient knockout juice, and it worked, allegedly. His most famous procedure? Opening up a warlord's abdomen to remove diseased tissue, then stitching him up, successfully. Though, as is tradition with trailblazing geniuses, Hua Tuo was later executed by a suspicious emperor who thought he was plotting sorcery. Great for science, bad for job security. Chinese surgical tools included bronze knives, needles, hooks, and cauterization irons, many of which mirrored modern instruments. But while the tools were there, the philosophy often discouraged invasive treatment. Illness, according to traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, came from disharmony in the body's energy pathways, the meridians, not from rogue organs or bad blood. So surgery was often the last resort, preceded by herbal therapy, massage, cupping, or acupuncture. Even so, the Chinese medical texts like the Huangdi Neijing show an impressive understanding of anatomy and injury management. They may not have dissected corpses like the Greeks, or patched up legions like the Romans, but when they operated, they did so with purpose, precision, and surprising sophistication. In the ancient cities of the Maya, Aztec, and Inca, surgery wasn't just a medical procedure. It was often tangled in ritual, warfare, and sheer practical necessity. While these civilizations are best known for stepped pyramids and human sacrifice, their surgical knowledge, especially in bone repair, wound care, and cranial modification, was far more advanced than many would guess. Let's start with their favourite surgical tool, obsidian blades. Razor sharp, sterile when freshly broken, and capable of slicing at a molecular level, obsidian scalpels were sharper than modern steel. In fact, some modern surgeons have experimented with obsidian blades because of how cleanly they cut tissue. The downside? They shatter. So, not exactly OSHA approved. The Inca, high in the Andes, were particularly famous for trepanation. Yes, more skull drilling. Archaeological evidence shows that Inca surgeons performed hundreds, if not thousands, of these procedures to treat head trauma, likely caused by slingstones or clubs in battle. Astonishingly, some patients survived not one, but multiple trepanations. Their recovery rates were often better than those in 19th century Europe, which tells you just how bad 19th century Europe was. The Aztecs, meanwhile, had a whole toolkit of plant-based anesthetics. They used herbs like tolosh, a type of datura, to dull pain and induce sleep, which was probably a good idea considering how often limbs needed to be amputated due to infection, frostbite, or punishment. Wounds were cleaned with urine or chili pepper tinctures, a strategy both antiseptic and memorable. Medical knowledge was closely guarded and passed down by tlacopanim, healers and surgeons, often trained from a young age. They treated abscesses, stitched wounds with maguey cactus fibres, and even reset fractures using splints made from wood or reeds. They understood that infection could kill and made efforts to clean and close wounds properly. But as in many ancient cultures, the line between medicine and ritual was thin. Surgery could be a healing act, or a ceremonial one. Sometimes cutting into flesh wasn't to save life, but to appease gods or read omens. If there was a moment in history when surgery got a proper upgrade, it was during the Islamic Golden Age. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, while most of Europe was busy bleeding patients with leeches and prayers, scholars in places like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were translating, preserving, and revolutionizing ancient medical knowledge. And nowhere did this fusion of scholarship and scalpel shine brighter than in Persian and Arab surgical advancements. Enter al-Zahrawi, also known in Latin as Abul Qasis, a 10th century physician from Al-Andalus, modern Spain, whose influence would echo through medical textbooks for centuries. His monumental work, the Kitab al-Tasrif, wasn't just a medical guide. It was a 30-volume encyclopedia, and the final volume was entirely devoted to surgery. The man didn't just list tools, he illustrated them. Over 200 surgical instruments, from forceps to scalpels to catheters, many of which bear a striking resemblance to what you'd find in a modern OR. Al-Zahrawi described treatments for fractures, cauterizations, dissections, and even caesarean sections and dental procedures. He emphasized precision, hygiene, and patient aftercare, a revolutionary concept in an age where post-op care often meant good luck and don't bleed on the floor. His work spread like wildfire. Translated into Latin, it became a standard surgical reference in Europe for over 500 years. This wasn't fringe knowledge, it was mainstream medical authority. Persian polymaths like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, also contributed heavily to surgical philosophy, even if he leaned more toward diagnosis and internal medicine. His canon of medicine outlined when and how surgery should be used and warned against operating when simpler remedies would suffice, advice that many modern surgeons could still take to heart. What made Islamic surgery exceptional was its balance of science, ethics, and documentation. Surgery wasn't just guesswork or superstition, it was a craft honed by observation, experimentation, and debate. Hospitals, bimaristans, often had lecture halls and libraries, where medical students trained alongside professionals, dissecting animals, reading Greek and Indian medical texts, and sharpening both their blades and their minds. After the scalpels have dulled, the obsidian shattered, and the trepanation holes healed, or didn't, what are we left with? A bizarre, brilliant, and sometimes horrifying legacy carved directly into the bones of history. Ancient surgery wasn't just about pain tolerance and bravery, it was about trial, error, and relentless human curiosity. Across cultures and continents, one theme emerges. People have always been willing to risk agony and death to fix what's broken. Whether it was a Roman legionary's gashed leg, an Egyptian farmer's abscess, or an Inca warrior's fractured skull, ancient surgeons stepped in where gods, prayers, and herbs had failed. And often, against all odds, they succeeded. Not everything aged well. The four humours? Gone. Evil spirits as a diagnosis? Retired. Urine as antiseptic? Hard pass. But many of their ideas still echo in modern medicine. The Indian rhinoplasty became the foundation for reconstructive plastic surgery. Roman battlefield triage evolved into emergency care systems. Chinese anesthesia, a spiritual ancestor to modern sedation. Even the cautery tools used in Islamic hospitals look eerily like devices found in today's surgical kits. What makes ancient surgery fascinating isn't just the gore, it's the ingenuity. These early practitioners had no microscopes, no understanding of microbes, and zero access to anesthesia. Yet they improvised, often brilliantly. They sharpened stones into scalpels, used wine and herbs as painkillers, and crafted metal tools that wouldn't look out of place in a 19th century drawer. It's also worth noting how cultural context shaped surgical decisions. In some places, like India and Persia, surgery was a respected profession backed by ethical codes and formal training. In others, it was a desperate act reserved for battlefield necessity or ritual. Some civilizations prioritized spiritual harmony, others bodily repair. Some poked, others prayed. Many did both. And yet, behind every successful operation was a terrifying gamble. No antibiotics, no numbing agents. Just hope, and maybe a chant or two. Before we dive into spirals, sunbursts, and eagle-winged warriors, we need to meet the people beneath the ink, the Illyrians. Not a single unified nation, but rather a mosaic of fierce, tribal peoples scattered across the Western Balkans, from the Adriatic Sea to the Dinaric Alps. Today, their lands stretch across modern-day Albania, Montenegro, Kosovo, Bosnia, parts of Croatia, and beyond. For centuries, they were known to the Greeks, feared by the Romans, and practically allergic to central authority. The Illyrians weren't scribbling epic poetry or founding marble cities. They were forging swords, raiding neighbours, and building hill forts that stared down anyone foolish enough to invade. The Greeks called them barbarians, mostly because the Illyrians had a habit of ignoring polite diplomacy and going straight for the throat. But despite that reputation, they had an incredibly rich cultural identity, visible not in scrolls but in symbols, carved, painted, and tattooed onto their bodies. They lived in tightly knit tribal groups, each with its own chieftain, customs, and often distinct symbolic languages. These symbols weren't decorative, they carried power, memory, and meaning. For the Illyrians, body art wasn't fashion. It was function, deeply tied to tribal identity, ritual practice, military status, and perhaps even spirituality. Archaeological finds, such as the Glasinac burial mounds and Tepes Hill necropolises, give us glimpses into their world. Jewellery etched with sun motifs, bronze plates depicting birds of prey, and pottery adorned with spirals. And while the skin doesn't survive the centuries, ancient authors fill in the gaps. Roman and Greek writers, Pliny the Elder, Strabo, and others, mention the Illyrians' use of tattoos, sometimes with a mix of admiration and horror. They weren't alone in the ink game, of course. Many ancient warrior societies, Scythians, Thracians, Celts, practiced tattooing. But the Illyrians, they embraced it like few others, embedding it in rites of passage, warrior pride, and feminine adornment. To truly understand Illyrian body art, you can't just look at what they wore. You have to imagine what they carried on their flesh: sun wheels to honour their gods, eagle feathers for courage, and sacred spirals echoing life, death, and the eternal cycle of war and rebirth. The Illyrians were a people of action. Their history is written not on paper, but on bone, bronze, and skin. When your alphabet is oral and your history is carved into hillsides, symbols become everything. The Illyrians didn't write epic sagas, but they were masters of visual language, embedding powerful meanings into their body art, jewellery, weapons, and ritual objects. To them, a spiral wasn't just a pretty shape, it was the very map of existence. Let's start with the spiral. Found carved into stone slabs, etched onto pottery, and inferred from art recovered in Illyrian burial sites, the spiral was one of the most recurring motifs. Its meaning? Likely tied to cycles, birth, death, rebirth, and possibly the sun's eternal rise and fall. For a warrior society that lived hard and died young, this was a comforting, defiant symbol. Life always returns, and if not you, then your bloodline. Then there's the sun disk, another frequent emblem. The Illyrians were sun worshippers, or at least sun-conscious. The solar wheel, often surrounded by radial lines or encircled in dots, represented vitality, divine favour, and masculine power. A man with a sun symbol inked on his chest may not have had six-pack abs, but he was broadcasting cosmic strength all the same. Eagles and birds of prey were also prominent. These weren't cute sparrows. They were symbols of war, nobility, and the divine connection between earth and sky. Roman accounts even mention that some Illyrian tribes, like the RDA, carried eagle standards into battle. An eagle tattoo, likely etched in jagged geometric lines, signified a man of rank, or at the very least, someone not to mess with. Geometric patterns, zigzags, triangles, and wave-like motifs are also seen repeatedly on artifacts and were likely mirrored in tattoos. These weren't random. Zigzags could symbolize lightning or water, while triangle clusters may have represented fertility or family lineage. A woman's tattoo might honor motherhood or tribal loyalty, just as a man's might celebrate bloodshed or divine favor. What's striking is how unified yet varied the symbols were. Some were clearly tribal markers, while others were spiritual sigils or personal totems. Each design was a declaration: who you were, what you believed, and how you wanted to be remembered. To the Illyrians, symbols were identity. You didn't just wear them, you became them. They were etched into the skin as if to say, "This is me, and this is forever." While the Illyrians didn't leave behind instruction manuals, the tools of their trade still whisper secrets through archaeology. And when it comes to body art, that whisper involves needles, ash, and a lot of pain. Illyrian tattooing, like most ancient traditions, was almost certainly a manual process. That meant no buzzing machines, no sterile gloves, just sharpened bronze or bone needles, rudimentary pigment, and a very steady hand. Some of the finest examples of Illyrian craftsmanship include delicate bronze pins, often thought to be fibulae or sewing tools, but some may have doubled as tattooing instruments. And if you think it's a stretch to imagine a warrior priest dabbing ash into someone's open skin with a bronze pin, you haven't met the Illyrians. The pigment, most likely a mix of charcoal, soot, and possibly ground herbs, blended into animal fat or oil to create a sticky, ink-like paste. This wasn't just to get the job done, it also had ritual significance. Some tribes may have mixed in sacred ashes, taken from burned totems or ceremonial fires, turning tattoos into portable talismans. The process likely involved puncturing or slicing the skin, rubbing the pigment in, and allowing it to heal, if infection didn't get there first. Healing would have involved honey, animal fat, or herbal salves, all known to the Illyrians through their close connection to nature and early forms of folk medicine. But these tattoos weren't done at random. They were likely applied during ceremonies or rites of passage, moments of transformation, a boy earning his first kill, a woman entering marriage, a warrior rising in rank. Some tattoos might even have been earned through ordeals, a scar becoming sacred once the ink sealed it. Pain wasn't a side effect, it was part of the point, and not everyone got one. Tattooing may have been limited to elites, warriors, or those in spiritual roles, a kind of inked aristocracy. Or in some tribes, it may have been widespread, used to distinguish clans or family lineages, much like tartans or totems in other ancient cultures. Among the Illyrians, war wasn't just an occasional nuisance, it was a way of life. Tribes fought for land, for honor, for vengeance, and sometimes just because it was Tuesday. In this brutal landscape, warriors weren't anonymous. They were marked, visibly, permanently, and with pride. Tattoos were not decorations, they were announcements. Imagine a warrior standing shirtless on a rocky hilltop, scarred and sunburned, the outline of a sun wheel or eagle wing spread across his chest. That wasn't ink for vanity. It was identity made flesh. It told his enemies where he came from, what he had endured, and how far he would go in battle. In a world with no written language, your skin was your resume. According to Roman sources like Pliny the Elder, many Illyrian tribes tattooed their bodies not just for aesthetics, but as rites of passage into warriorhood. A spiral etched into the arm might mark a first battle survived. An eagle on the back? Proof of a warrior's rise through the tribal ranks. Tattoos acted like living medals, except instead of hanging on a wall, they bled when you moved. There's evidence that certain designs were clan-specific, marking a warrior's tribe or bloodline. This wasn't just a cultural flex, it was practical. On a chaotic battlefield, being able to identify friend from foe mattered. And after the battle, a tattoo might help return a body to its people, or explain why it didn't make it home. The placement of these tattoos was just as intentional. Chest and shoulders for rank, arms and hands for martial achievements. The back might bear symbols of divine protection, perhaps sun discs or thunderbirds, calling down the favour of celestial gods. And yes, some Illyrian warriors likely tattooed their faces, either to terrify enemies or honour the gods. Imagine going up against someone who carved lightning bolts into their cheekbones. You'd think twice. But it wasn't all glory. Tattoos also told stories of punishment or penance. A dishonoured warrior might be tattooed with a mark of shame, something small, permanent, and impossible to hide. It was a society where ink could elevate you, or remind you, every time you looked in the mirror, that you failed. When we think of ancient tattoos, it's easy to picture grizzled warriors, inked with spirals and eagle talons. But among the Illyrians, women too wore their stories on their skin. And their tattoos weren't just ornamental. They were spiritual, social, and deeply symbolic. In some Illyrian tribes, tattooing was a rite of passage for girls, especially around puberty or marriage. These weren't random patterns or dainty flourishes. They were sacred marks passed down through generations, each line telling a story of lineage, role, and power. And archaeological finds, like bronze mirror cases, spindle whorls, and jewellery etched with repeated triangles, sunbursts, and wavy lines. Mirror patterns, scholars believe, were once inked onto women's arms, legs, and faces. One common motif was the triangle, often grouped in patterns that likely represented fertility, femininity, and the divine cycle of life. Some believe these tattoos served as protective symbols during childbirth, warding off spirits and invoking blessings from the tribal deities, goddesses of earth, moon, and water. Face tattoos, yes, face, may have also been common among Illyrian women of certain tribes. Tiny marks near the eyes, on the chin, or across the brow weren't signs of rebellion. They were badges of cultural pride, beauty, or status. Roman writers, typically bewildered or dismissive of barbarian customs, occasionally mention the strikingly marked women of the Balkans, their ink described as exotic, wild, or tribal mysticism. But tattoos weren't just about beauty or tradition. They could be emblems of grief, loyalty, or vengeance. A widow might tattoo a mourning symbol on her skin, a broken sun or coiled spiral, while others might bear ink representing vows taken in blood. The skin became a scroll of silent declarations, especially in a culture where oral memory mattered more than written records. And it wasn't limited to the elite. Some evidence suggests that common women, especially among hill tribes, bore simpler tattoos, perhaps marks of family allegiance or local gods. Meanwhile, priestesses or spiritual healers may have had far more elaborate designs, using their bodies as living talismans to channel divine power. For the Illyrians, tattooing wasn't just social or decorative, it was deeply spiritual. In a world where gods lived in rivers, mountains, and thunder, every mark on the body had the potential to channel divine energy. Ink was a ritual, and the body was the altar. Though much of Illyrian religion has been reconstructed from fragments, burial mounds, grave goods, and second-hand Roman descriptions, we know they worshipped a mix of nature deities, solar gods, and tribal spirits, and their tattoos reflected this animistic worldview. Spirals might represent eternity and the cosmos, while birds symbolized the soul in flight. To be tattooed wasn't simply a style choice, it was to align yourself with cosmic forces. Many scholars believe tattoos were applied during seasonal festivals or initiation rites overseen by tribal shamans or priestesses. These were no quiet, private moments. They were public ceremonies, sometimes involving drumming, chanting, and ritual pain. The act of bleeding was seen as part of the offering, pain forged a connection between the human and the divine. Certain symbols may have been reserved only for those who had undergone spiritual training. A healer, for instance, might bear a mark of the earth goddess, or a series of protective bands down their arm intended to ward off malevolent spirits. Warriors could receive sacred symbols before heading into battle, not just as morale boosters, but as magical armour, visible pledges of loyalty to the gods. There's also speculation that tattoos played a role in funerary practices. Bodies discovered in Illyrian necropolises are often surrounded by symbolic objects: mirrors, bird effigies, sun discs. If the skin had survived, it might have revealed matching ink, meant to guide the deceased into the afterlife or signal their status to the ancestors. In some tribes, it's believed that only the tattooed could pass into the realm of the spirits unchallenged. Everyone else was just a ghost. Even the tattooing materials may have had ritual significance. Ashes from sacred fires, or pigments mixed with herbs blessed under the full moon, weren't just antiseptic. They were spiritually charged. The line between medicine, magic, and art was razor thin. Among the Illyrians, a tattoo could do what no scroll or passport ever could. It told everyone who you were. In a tribal society where loyalty ran deeper than laws, your status, rank, and bloodline were often written directly on your skin. Each Illyrian tribe had its own distinct visual culture, emblems, patterns, and motifs that marked their warriors, their leaders, and their kin. A curved sun motif might belong to one clan, a zigzag-lined mountain symbol to another. These marks weren't just personal, they were tribal signatures, visual shorthand for identity in a fragmented, war-prone region. For the elite, chieftains, nobles, and tribal champions, tattoos could serve as badges of authority. A man inked with layered spirals, sunbursts, and eagle talons wasn't just showing off. He was announcing his victories, ancestry, and social rank to everyone he met. These marks acted like heraldic shields, unique, symbolic, and instantly recognizable. Women of high status may have worn more intricate designs, tattoos arranged in rows or mirrored shapes across the forearms or collarbone, symbolizing fertility, spiritual favor, or noble lineage. Some motifs likely indicated a woman's connection to a priestess class, tribal oracle, or healer lineage. Status wasn't just for warriors. There's also strong evidence that kinship tattoos existed. Simple symbols shared across families to indicate belonging. Think of it like an ancient surname, except it was permanent, visible, and woven with myth. In battle or in life, it told others, "I am of this blood," and that could either save you or mark you for vengeance. Placement mattered. Upper arms and chests were prime real estate for warriors, signalling strength and achievements. Facial tattoos were reserved for those with sacred or social importance, often worn with pride but never lightly. A symbol on the hand might mean sworn defender of this clan. A mark on the back might indicate a protector role, or perhaps a reminder of some personal oath. As tribes fought, merged, or dissolved, these symbols served as cultural anchors, a permanent reminder of where you came from, no matter how borders shifted. In a world where identity was constantly tested by war and survival, the ink on your body could speak louder than any words. When the Romans marched into Illyrian territory, they didn't just conquer with legions, they brought with them a very different worldview. To the Roman eye, Illyrian body art was something between barbaric ritual and tribal witchcraft. And as with most things the Romans didn't understand, they reacted with a mix of disdain, fear, and grudging fascination. Roman historians like Strabo and Pliny the Elder describe Illyrians as tattooed savages, their skin covered in strange patterns that marked them as uncivilized. Of course, this was rich, coming from a culture that loved public executions and wore wolf pelts for fun. But still, Illyrian tattoos became one of the visual symbols that set these people apart, and not in a good way. To Roman elites, body art was shameful. Tattoos in their world were associated with criminals, slaves, and soldiers, not warriors or nobility. So when the empire absorbed Illyrian territories, One of the first cultural casualties was tattooing. It was discouraged, suppressed, and in some cases, outright banned. But erasure was never that simple. Roman soldiers stationed in the Balkans sometimes adopted local customs, tattoos included. There's evidence that Illyrian auxiliaries serving in the Roman army kept their tribal markings, and while they might have traded in their traditional gear for a Roman lorica, the symbols on their skin whispered a different loyalty. Meanwhile, Illyrian women likely continued the tradition in private, passing down symbols and meanings long after Rome tried to erase them. Cultural memory, after all, is stubborn, and tattoos, especially the homemade kind done in secret, are even more so. Ironically, as Roman influence spread, so did a modified version of Illyrian body art. Some Romanized Balkan populations continued to use tattooing for spiritual or tribal identity, though with more subtlety. The original meanings may have faded, but the impulse, the need to mark the skin with story and identity, persisted. What began as a sacred declaration slowly became a cultural battleground. Tattoos went underground, hidden from Roman scrutiny, but never fully forgotten. Even centuries later, echoes of Illyrian designs reappeared in folk embroidery, ceremonial clothing, and family motifs, transferred from skin to fabric, from generation to generation. Though the Illyrian tribes vanished into history, conquered, assimilated, and scattered, their ink didn't. It migrated, transformed, and echoed through generations, leaving behind subtle fingerprints in the Balkans that endure even today. You won't find Illyrians walking around anymore, but their symbols are still alive. In Albanian folk costumes, traditional jewellery, stone carvings, and even tattoos. Yes, modern tattoo artists across Albania, Kosovo, and Bosnia have begun resurrecting ancient Illyrian designs. Spirals, eagles, suns, and geometric bands, reimagined with pride, reclaimed as cultural identity. In some rural Albanian regions, women's face tattoos persisted well into the 20th century. Often faint and worn by time, these marks, small crosses, stars, or spirals, were passed down by oral tradition. For the women who bore them, the meaning was rarely decorative. They were protective, ancestral, and tribal, just as they had been thousands of years earlier. Even outside of tattoos, Illyrian symbols have made their way into modern state iconography. The Albanian double-headed eagle, flying proudly on the national flag, echoes ancient Illyrian motifs of predatory birds as symbols of strength, vision, and divine authority. Historians argue whether the eagle symbol travelled directly from Illyria or through Byzantine heraldry. But in the minds of many Albanians, it's a direct cultural heir. In contemporary culture, especially among Balkan youth searching for roots beyond Roman ruins and Ottoman legacies, Illyrian imagery has become a kind of subcultural renaissance. Artists, musicians, and scholars reference Illyrian designs in fashion, album covers, murals, and digital art. What was once lost in burial mounds is now printed on t-shirts and inked across chests, not as costume, but as reclaiming. Academic interest is resurging too. Archaeologists and historians continue to uncover artifacts with unmistakable body art motifs, while linguists try to trace Illyrian names and words in regional dialects. And as DNA technology advances, even biological links to Illyrian populations are being explored, adding new dimensions to old ink. So while the original meanings may be buried under centuries of conquest, suppression, and cultural drift, one thing is clear: the Illyrian tradition of marking the body as a statement of identity, honour, and belonging never truly died. It was simply waiting for the next generation to listen. And when they did, they didn't write it in books. They wrote it in ink, just like the ancestors. Born in 1485 in the small town of Medellin in the Kingdom of Castile, Hernán Cortés came into the world with no royal title, no army, and no land, just ambition and a knack for ignoring authority. He was a thin, restless boy sent to study law at the University of Salamanca where he learned just enough Latin and legal theory to get bored and drop out. Spain, after all, was bursting with tales of new continents, indigenous empires, and unimaginable riches across the Atlantic. Why read dusty law scrolls when you could steal an empire? In 1504, at the age of 19, Cortés set sail for the New World, landing in Hispaniola, the Spanish base in the Caribbean. He quickly embedded himself in colonial society, taking land, managing enslaved labourers, and gaining political clout. By 1511, he joined Diego Velázquez on the brutal conquest of Cuba, where he earned a reputation for courage, cunning, and a dangerous tendency to defy orders. He was rewarded with wealth and influence, but he wanted more. Much more. By 1518, rumours swirled of a vast empire to the west. Rich cities, feathered warriors, and gold piled like firewood. Velázquez, now governor of Cuba, reluctantly appointed Cortés to lead an expedition to explore and trade along the coast of Mexico. But as Cortés prepared his ships, Velázquez had second thoughts and revoked the order. Cortés, in typical Cortés fashion, ignored him. He sailed anyway, in February 1519, with 11 ships, 500 soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, and an unhealthy amount of gunpowder and ambition. From the start, Cortés wasn't interested in trading beads for coconuts. He wanted conquest, and he had a plan. A blend of diplomacy, deceit, religious fervour, and brutal violence. His goal? Not just gold, but glory, and a title in the Spanish crown's hierarchy. The man was no brute in armour. He was a master manipulator who could charm native leaders one day and burn their cities the next. Unlike many of his companions, Cortés saw the indigenous civilizations not as obstacles, but as systems that could be exploited, infiltrated, and turned against themselves. By the time he landed on the Yucatan Peninsula, Hernán Cortés was already dreaming of emperors, pyramids, and plunder. The age of exploration was over. The age of conquest had begun, with Cortés at the helm. When Hernán Cortés arrived on the Yucatan Peninsula in early 1519, he wasn't greeted with fanfare. He was greeted with arrows. The Maya, seasoned warriors and survivors of previous Spanish raids weren't exactly thrilled to see more pale men with steel and horses. The first encounters turned bloody quickly. Battles fought in the thick humidity, between Spanish firearms and obsidian-tipped spears. But these skirmishes gave Cortés something far more valuable than gold: information. He soon learned of a vast empire to the west, ruled by a mysterious king called Moctezuma, seated atop a mountain of wealth in a city larger than anything Spain had ever seen. The empire? The Aztecs. The prize. Everything. In these early encounters, Cortés also acquired two critical assets. First, a Spanish castaway named Jerónimo de Aguilar, who had survived for years in Maya territory and now spoke the local languages fluently. Second, and far more influential, a young woman named Malintzin, known to the Spanish as La Malinche. A gifted linguist and keen observer, she could translate Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and she quickly became Cortés's advisor, interpreter, and consort. Through her, Cortés gained not just words, but power. Armed with these linguistic tools, Cortés began his real conquest, not with swords, but with strategy. As he advanced along the coast, he encountered the Totonacs, a tribe oppressed by Aztec tribute demands. Sensing opportunity, Cortés offered protection, and in return, the Totonacs offered men, food, and local knowledge. It was the first of many indigenous alliances that would become central to his campaign. Then, in a show of irreversible intent, Cortés committed the most dramatic gesture of his career. He scuttled his ships, burned them, sank them. Whatever the version, the message was clear: no turning back. His men would conquer or die trying. The Spanish were now land-bound invaders in a foreign continent, surrounded by unknown enemies, unfamiliar diseases, and vast empires. But Cortés had something his adversaries didn't: a fragmented political landscape he could manipulate, a hunger for glory, and a mind that played war like chess. The conquest of the Aztec Empire wouldn't start in Tenochtitlan. It started here, in the jungles of the Yucatan, with blood, alliances, and a translator who would shape the fate of continents. With his ships destroyed and his men committed, Hernán Cortés turned inland, toward the beating heart of the Aztec Empire, the fabled city of Tenochtitlan. But getting there wasn't just a matter of marching, it was a masterclass in manipulation, bloodshed, and betrayal. His first major obstacle and opportunity was the Tlaxcalans, fierce mountain warriors who had resisted Aztec dominance for generations. At first, they met the Spanish with spears, slings, and all-out war. The fighting was brutal. Cortés's muskets and cavalry caused chaos, but the Tlaxcalans refused to break. The Spanish were outnumbered, exhausted, and nearly overwhelmed. And then, suddenly, Cortés offered them peace. Peace, and a chance at revenge. The Tlaxcalans, seeing in Cortés a weapon to aim at their Aztec overlords, accepted. They didn't trust him, but they hated Moctezuma more. The alliance was forged in blood, and it gave Cortés something Spain could never have provided. Thousands of indigenous warriors who knew the terrain, the politics, and the Aztec psyche. With Tlaxcalan support, Cortés moved on to Cholula, a wealthy city and a religious center. But something went wrong. Whether a planned ambush or a misunderstood signal, Cortés ordered a massacre. Spanish soldiers and Tlaxcalan allies stormed the city, slaughtering nobles and priests. Temples burned. The message was unmistakable. Submit or perish. And then came the moment Moctezuma couldn't ignore. Cortés approached Tenochtitlan, the Venice of the New World, a floating metropolis of dazzling temples, canals, and stone causeways. Built in the middle of Lake Texcoco, it was unlike anything the Spanish had ever seen. And shockingly, Cortés was welcomed. Moctezuma, uncertain whether Cortés was a man or a god, invited him into the city. The Spanish entered as honored guests, but Cortés had no intention of leaving. He took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace, a bloodless coup fueled by diplomacy and fear. Cortés was now inside the empire, manipulating it from within. He didn't just seize power, he began dismantling the spiritual foundations of the Aztec world. Temples were defaced, idols destroyed, crosses erected in their place. Cortés wasn't just waging war, he was unmaking a civilization, brick by brick, god by god, and the clock was ticking. The Spanish were few, the city was watching, and in the shadows, resistance was beginning to boil. Hernán Cortés had done the impossible. He'd seized the heart of the Aztec Empire without a pitched battle, but holding a city of 200,000 people with a few hundred Spaniards and some tribal allies, that was fantasy. The thin veneer of control was already cracking, and it didn't take much to shatter it completely. While Cortés played puppet master in Tenochtitlan, trouble brewed behind him. A rival Spanish expedition, sent by Diego Velázquez to arrest him for insubordination, landed on the coast. Cortés left the capital in the hands of his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, and marched out to deal with the threat. He defeated the newcomers, absorbed their men into his ranks, and returned, only to find the city in chaos. Why? Alvarado had done what conquistadors did best. He massacred unarmed Aztec nobles during a religious festival. Thousands were slaughtered inside a temple courtyard. Blood soaked the altars. It was an unforgivable insult, and it lit the fuse of a full-scale uprising. Tenochtitlan exploded. The Spanish were besieged in the palace, trapped in a city they no longer controlled. Streets turned into kill zones. Bridges were pulled up. Stones, arrows, and rage rained down. Cortés brought back reinforcements, but it was too late. Moctezuma, once the emperor of the Aztecs, now a prisoner of his own hospitality, was dead. Accounts differ. Some say he was killed by his own people, enraged by his weakness. Others claim the Spanish murdered him when he became a liability. Either way, his death marked the end of diplomacy and the beginning of carnage. Cortés had no choice but to flee. In the dead of night on June 30th, 1520, the Spanish attempted a desperate escape across the causeways. The Aztecs were waiting. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcalan allies were slaughtered. Gold-laden soldiers sank into the lake. The night would be remembered forever as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Cortés barely escaped with his life. Bloodied, humiliated, and broken, he retreated to Tlaxcala. But he wasn't beaten. He would regroup. And when he returned, it wouldn't be as a guest or intruder. It would be as a destroyer. The empire had drawn blood. Now Cortés would return with fire. After the disaster of La Noche Triste, Hernán Cortés did what most men wouldn't. He came back stronger. Retreating to Tlaxcala, he rebuilt his army, not just with Spaniards, but with tens of thousands of indigenous allies. For every enemy Cortés had made, he found two more who hated the Aztec yoke. He offered revenge, liberation, and a cut of the loot. It worked. He also built ships. Yes, ships, dragging them in pieces from the Gulf Coast through jungle and over mountains to reassemble on Lake Texcoco. The Aztecs ruled the water. Cortés now planned to challenge them at sea. It was the kind of mad plan that only works if you're desperate, brilliant, or both. By May 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan began. Cortés cut off aqueducts and supply routes. The city, surrounded by water, became an island of starvation. His brigantines, Spanish warships with cannons, swept through the canals, destroying Aztec canoes. Street by street, the Spanish and their allies fought their way into the city, reducing it to rubble. But the Aztecs didn't go quietly. Under the leadership of Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's nephew and the new emperor, the Aztecs fought with ferocity. They laid traps, launched ambushes, and refused to surrender. It became a war of attrition and annihilation. Temples were toppled. Markets became battlefields. Disease, starvation, and fire did the rest. Meanwhile, smallpox, likely introduced by a single infected Spanish slave, ripped through the population. The epidemic did what steel and gunpowder couldn't. It wiped out entire neighborhoods, decimating warriors and priests alike. It's estimated that tens of thousands died before they ever saw a Spanish sword. By August 13th, 1521, after 93 days of siege, the once mighty Tenochtitlan was a smoking ruin. Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to flee across the lake. He was brought before Cortés, proud, defiant, and defeated. And just like that, the Aztec Empire ceased to exist. Cortés entered the shattered city not as a visitor, but as its conqueror. He had turned a collection of alliances and bold gambits into one of history's most dramatic military victories. But he didn't just topple a ruler. He obliterated a civilization. Temples were leveled, codices burned. A new capital, Mexico City, would rise from the ruins. And Cortés, he had won an empire, but the blood was ankle-deep. With Tenochtitlan reduced to rubble, Hernán Cortés stood atop the ashes of an empire. But conquest was only step one. Now came colonization, and Cortés was eager to reshape the Aztec world in the image of Spain. The city was renamed Mexico Tenochtitlan, and later just Mexico City, quickly becoming the capital of New Spain. Where once stood temples dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Quetzalcoatl, now rose Catholic cathedrals, built, quite literally, using the stones of the old gods. The Spanish weren't just replacing rulers, they were rewriting reality. Cortés acted swiftly. He distributed encomiendas, land grants that came with indigenous labourers. While Spain called it a system of protection and conversion, in practice it was slavery, in all but name. Former Aztec nobles who cooperated were given minor titles. Those who resisted were silenced, permanently. The survivors of Tenochtitlan faced forced labour, disease, famine, and relentless Christianization. The Spanish crown, meanwhile, had a problem. Cortés had defied orders, scuttled his ships, started a war, and created an empire, all without royal permission. He had made himself a marquis, distributed wealth like a king, and minted his own version of law. To some, he was a hero. To others, a dangerously ambitious renegade. Back in Spain, the monarchy sent inspectors, clerics, and rival officials to investigate. Cortés was summoned back to defend himself, and though he retained some honours and titles, the crown never fully trusted him again. His grip on New Spain slowly slipped as royal authority reasserted control. Still, the damage was done. Over the next decades, millions of indigenous people would die, mostly from disease, but also from war, forced labour, and cultural destruction. Whole cities vanished, languages faded. What remained was a hybrid world, part Spanish, part indigenous, and permanently changed. Cortés tried to reclaim his influence with expeditions into Central America, searching for new kingdoms to conquer. But he never repeated the triumph of Tenochtitlan. He returned to Spain rich but politically marginalized, resented, sued, and slowly forgotten. Yet the legacy he left behind was irreversible. With the fall of the Aztecs, Cortés had opened the floodgates. Conquistadors, priests, and settlers poured into the Americas, all chasing gold, glory, or God. He hadn't just claimed a city, he had reshaped a continent, forever. While the Aztec Empire fell with fire and steel, the Maya were a different story entirely. Hernán Cortés may have crushed Tenochtitlan, but when he turned his gaze southeast toward the Mayan lowlands, he encountered something far more frustrating than a single city-state, a labyrinth of kingdoms, jungles, and endless resistance. In 1524, driven by ambition and rumours of gold and glory beyond the mountains, Cortés led an expedition into what is now Honduras and Guatemala. It was supposed to be quick, another sweep of conquest, another feather in his blood-stained cap. Instead, it became a march through hellish terrain. The jungles were dense, the rivers unpredictable, and the enemies elusive. Cortés wasn't fighting a centralized empire. He was confronting dozens of Maya city-states, each with their own rulers, languages, and grudges. And they didn't roll over. The Maya were no strangers to war. Though their classic-era cities had faded by the 9th century, many still had functioning militaries, fortified towns, and traditions of guerrilla resistance. They attacked supply lines, ambushed from the trees, and disappeared into the canopy. Unlike the Aztecs, who had ceremonial rules for warfare, the Maya fought to exhaust, confuse, and harass. They didn't need to win battles, they just needed to outlast their invaders. Cortés made temporary alliances, intimidated some towns into submission, and raised others. But for every victory, he lost men to disease, starvation, and mutiny. His own soldiers began to question his judgment. One of his most humiliating moments came when he had to arrest and execute his own followers for conspiracy, in the middle of the jungle. The Maya campaign achieved little. Cortés managed to reach Honduras and assert Spanish dominance over a few territories, but he never truly conquered the Maya. In fact, some Maya cities wouldn't be fully subdued until the late 1600s, over a century after Cortés died. The jungle, the fragmentation, and the Maya's resilience made them one of the longest-holding indigenous powers in the Americas. For Cortés, the journey was a bitter reminder. Not every kingdom falls like Tenochtitlan. He had crushed an empire, but the Maya, rooted in vines, stone, and silence, would not be so easily erased. While Hernán Cortés brought muskets, swords, and cavalry to the Americas, his most effective weapon was one he never controlled: disease. Long before the final Aztec warriors fell, smallpox, measles, and influenza had already begun their quiet genocide. The first smallpox outbreak in Mexico is believed to have arrived in 1520, carried by an infected African servant travelling with one of the Spanish ships. From that moment on, the conquest changed. The Aztecs could fight steel, they could resist religious imposition, but they could not fight something they couldn't see, touch, or understand. Within a year, smallpox swept through Tenochtitlan, weakening the defenders just as Cortés returned to lay siege. Entire families died in their homes. Priests, generals, and city leaders, those who held the empire together, perished in weeks. The disease didn't just kill bodies, it shattered social structure, morale, and resistance. As the Spanish pushed deeper into Mesoamerica, the pattern repeated. In places Cortés had never even reached, millions died. Some estimates suggest that within a century of contact, up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas was wiped out, not by war, but by waves of European plagues. Whole cities became ghost towns without a single Spanish sword ever being drawn. And disease didn't just kill, it changed everything. Survivors fled their homes, abandoned traditions, and sought answers from new gods. Many interpreted the plagues as divine punishment, which missionaries quickly exploited, offering baptism as salvation. In this way, Christianity didn't just arrive with crosses and sermons, it arrived on a wave of biological apocalypse. Cortés understood the power of timing. He saw firsthand how smallpox softened the Aztecs before his second assault. But the long-term effects went far beyond strategy. Disease depopulated the labour force, collapsed agricultural systems, and erased countless languages, rituals, and oral histories. Cultures were unmade in silence, with no last stand, no monument, no eulogy. In the end, Cortés's conquest wasn't just a tale of ambition and battle. It was part of something bigger. The Columbian Exchange didn't just move horses and gold, it moved plagues, and the cost was incalculable. The sword may have conquered cities, but disease conquered civilizations. Hernán Cortés died in 1547, old, bitter, and largely forgotten by the empire he helped build. Once hailed as the man who toppled the Aztec Empire, he spent his final years battling lawsuits, enemies, and his own fading relevance. He'd won an empire, yes, but lost control of it. Spain moved on, and Cortés, once its boldest conquistador, became an awkward symbol of everything it both admired and feared. His legacy is a contradiction carved into history. To some, especially in old Spanish chronicles, he was a genius commander, a devout Christian warrior who brought civilization to the so-called savages. To others, he was a ruthless invader, a man whose ambition led to mass murder, cultural annihilation, and the collapse of one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the pre-modern world. But even hero and villain don't fully capture what Cortés was. He wasn't a mindless butcher, nor was he some noble visionary. He was calculated, manipulative, deeply intelligent, and unrelentingly ambitious. He forged alliances, exploited divisions, and played his enemies like chess pieces. His conquest wasn't just about firepower. It was about knowing when to shake hands, when to burn temples, and when to rewrite the rules entirely. And the consequences? Monumental. The fall of the Aztec Empire opened the gates for centuries of colonial rule, the forced Christianization of millions, and the transfer of unimaginable wealth from the Americas to Europe. At the same time, it marked the birth of a new world, one not entirely European or indigenous, but something strange and in between, mestizo, hybrid, and forever altered. Cortés also left a trail of unfinished wounds. In Mexico, he is remembered with ambivalence and anger. Streets and schools once bore his name. Many now don't. Monuments to him exist, but they often gather dust, graffiti, or protest. He's the man who brought Spanish, Catholicism, and Western architecture, and the man who destroyed temples, languages, and entire ways of life. Even his remains are controversial. Buried, moved, hidden, his bones, like his story, refuse to rest peacefully. So who was Hernán Cortés? Conqueror, destroyer, founder, traitor, visionary, criminal? Or perhaps something worse, a man who changed the course of history, not because he was extraordinary, but because he was perfectly suited to a violent, opportunistic age that rewarded bold men who acted without hesitation.